The moment we parked, a crowd began to emerge from the shadows of the abandoned factories. These people were in terrible shape. Some were limping on heavily bandaged, infected legs. Some were shivering so violently they could barely stand. There is a very specific type of monster that Hollywood likes to sell us. We've all seen the movies. The dead rising from their graves, shuffling mindlessly down abandoned streets, completely stripped of their humanity and driven by pure biological impulse. We watch those movies. We get our cheap jump scares. And then we turn off the TV, feeling safe in the knowledge that zombies aren't real. But if you take a drive down Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you'll realize that the horror movies got it wrong. The monsters are real. But they didn't crawl out of a graveyard. They were manufactured. They were created by a broken system, by synthetic chemicals, and by a local government that decided it's easier to sweep human misery under the rug than it is to actually fix it. The true horror of the modern American city isn't found in haunted houses. It's found in the zoning laws, the city ordinances, and the cold, calculated ways we have decided to quarantine our most desperate people out of sight. What you are about to hear are 3 true, first-hand accounts from the shadow of the Market Frankfurt L train. These are stories of a neighborhood that has become an open-air necropolis. There are no ghosts in these stories, just pure, human-centric social horror. Here are 3 terrifying true stories from the streets of Kensington. Story 1. The Blue Dress and the Bracelet. If you've never been to Kensington Avenue, it's hard to accurately describe the atmosphere. The best way I can explain it is that it feels like a hallway with no ceiling lights. The Market Frankfurt line, an elevated commuter train we call the L, runs directly over the avenue. It's this massive rusting structure of steel and concrete that blocks out the sun. Even at noon on a Tuesday, the street is bathed in this claustrophobic, perpetual shadow. And every 10 minutes, a train roars overhead, drowning out every other sound with a deafening metallic screech. I've lived in Philly my whole life, and I spent a few years volunteering at a small harm reduction storefront right near the Somerset station. You get used to a lot of things down there. You get used to the hollowed-out buildings. You get used to the sheer volume of people living on the sidewalks. And you get used to the Kensington nod. People standing upright, completely frozen, folded in half at the waist, defying gravity in a deep chemical stupor. It's the signature of the local drug supply, a brutal mix of synthetic fentanyl and an animal tranquilizer called xylazine. To survive working down there, you have to build a psychological wall. You have to accept that you can't save everyone. You hand out clean water, you hand out clean socks, and you hope for the best. For a while, the routine was manageable. Just another grim day in a forgotten zip code. But on a Thursday morning in early September, the systemic nightmare of this city was laid bare in a way that completely shattered my psychological wall. It was around 11 a.m. I was standing outside the storefront with another volunteer, taking a quick coffee break. The avenue was busy, the usual chaotic mix of dealers on the corners and people shuffling past. That's when I noticed her. About 100 feet away, near the entrance to the train station, a woman was lying completely motionless on the concrete. Now, seeing someone asleep on the sidewalk isn't unusual here. But something about her posture was fundamentally wrong. She was incredibly frail, skeletal almost, wearing a faded blue dress with a flower pattern and white tennis shoes. The red flag wasn't her stillness, it was her skin. From where I was standing, I could see that her face and neck were a ghastly, unnatural white. The color had been entirely drained from her body. I dropped my coffee and sprinted over to her, my coworker right behind me. As I got closer, the details became horrifying. Her lips were a deep, bruised gray. Her eyes were open, but they had rolled completely into the back of her head, showing nothing but yellowed sclera. Her right arm was twisted at an awkward angle, her hand locked into a rigid, claw-like shape. But the detail that made my blood run absolutely cold was what she was wearing on her wrist. Wrapped tightly around her skeletal, bruised arm were 3 distinct plastic hospital bracelets. They were fresh. The printed dates on them were from the night before. My brain struggled to process what I was looking at. This wasn't just someone who had overdosed on the street. This was someone who had been inside a well-funded modern medical facility mere hours ago. She had been in a hospital bed. A doctor had seen her. A nurse had taken her vitals. They had treated whatever acute issue brought her in. Maybe a broken bone, maybe a severe infection. And then, fully aware that she was suffering from severe, life-threatening addiction and had no home to return to, the hospital had simply discharged her. They had taken a dying woman, printed out some discharge papers she probably couldn't even read, and dumped her directly back into the most lethal environment on the East Coast. It was the absolute horrific realization that the system doesn't view these people as patients. It views them as biological garbage. "She's not breathing," my coworker yelled, dropping to his knees. I pulled the Narcan nasal spray from my utility belt. If you've never seen Narcan administered, it's not a gentle medical procedure. It is a violent biochemical shock. It rips the opioids off the brain's receptors in a matter of seconds. I tilted her head back and sprayed the dose up her nose. We waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The screech of the L train roared overhead, shaking the concrete beneath my knees. Nothing. I grabbed a second dose. Fentanyl combined with animal tranquilizers is incredibly stubborn. I sprayed the second dose and started doing hard, rhythmic sternum rubs, grinding my knuckles into her chest bone to try and shock her nervous system into feeling pain. Suddenly, she gasped. It was a wet, ragged, terrifying sound, like someone breaking the surface of the water after nearly drowning. Her eyes snapped back down, dilated and wide with absolute panic. She bolted upright, coughing violently, her frail body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. She was alive. We had literally dragged her back from the other side. I expected her to be confused, maybe cry, or at least take a moment to realize she had just been clinically dead on a filthy sidewalk. But the horror of Kensington is that the biological imperative of the drug overrides every single fundamental human instinct, including the instinct for self-preservation. She didn't thank us. She didn't ask what happened. The moment she realized she was awake, a look of profound, agonizing despair washed over her face. She had been plunged into precipitated withdrawal. Every nerve in her body was suddenly screaming in pain, cold sweats breaking out on her forehead. "Where is it?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Before I could even speak, she was on her hands and knees, ignoring us completely, frantically scraping her bleeding fingernails against the concrete. She was looking for the needle she had dropped when her heart stopped. She was angry that we had woken her up. She was upset about a wasted hit. I stood up, stepping back as she crawled around my boots. I looked at the hospital bracelets dangling from her wrist. The state had abandoned her, the medical system had discarded her, and the chemicals had completely rewired her brain. We hadn't saved her life. We had just hit the reset button on a nightmare loop she couldn't escape. I walked back to the storefront, locked the door, and just stared out the window for a long time. The scariest part of Kensington isn't that people are dying. It's that nobody in charge actually cares. Story 2. The Invisible Cage. When people hear about human trafficking, they usually picture some Hollywood movie plot. Someone gets kidnapped out of a foreign airport, thrown into the back of a white van, and locked in a basement with heavy chains. I used to think that too. I grew up in a quiet, boring, middle-class suburb right outside of Philly. I had a master's degree. I was the textbook definition of someone who thought, that could never happen to me. But the thing about the opioid crisis is that it is the great equalizer. It doesn't care about your GPA, it doesn't care about your zip code, and it definitely doesn't care about your arrogance. It started with prescription painkillers after a minor car accident. And within 2 years, I had completely burned my life to the ground. I lost my job, alienated my family, and eventually found myself migrating to where the supply was cheapest and most potent. I ended up on Kensington Avenue. Living on the avenue feels like existing in a caste system. Once you cross that invisible boundary, you aren't a citizen anymore. You are a ghost. Your entire existence shrinks down to a single biological objective: avoid getting dope sick. If you've never experienced fentanyl withdrawal, there are no words in the English language to accurately convey the terror of it. It's not just a bad flu. It feels like your bones are made of crushed glass, your muscles are violently tearing themselves apart, and your brain is drowning in a panic attack that never ends. You feel like you are actively, agonizingly dying. I had been on the avenue for about 3 months. I was sleeping on pieces of cardboard under an overpass near Jasper Street. It was late November, the temperature was dropping, and I was dangerously sick. I hadn't used in almost 2 days, and my body was shutting down. I was curled in a ball, violently shivering, sweating through my dirty clothes. That's when a guy approached me. He told me his name was Marcus. He was well-dressed, completely sober-looking, and had this calm, unnervingly polite demeanor. "You look like you're in a bad way, sweetheart," he said, crouching down next to me. I couldn't even form words. I just nodded, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they would crack. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small blue glassine bags, the local stamp. He handed them to me, completely free of charge. Then, he pointed to a row of dilapidated, boarded-up row homes about a block away. "I got a warm room up there, safe space. Nobody bothers you," he said smoothly. "You can come get straight, get some sleep out of the cold. No pressure." In a normal state of mind, every alarm bell in my head would have been ringing. You don't follow a strange man into an abandoned building. But I wasn't in a normal state of mind. I was a cornered animal, and he was holding the cure to the worst agony I had ever felt. The promise of the drug, combined with the promise of warmth, completely short-circuited my survival instincts. I grabbed my backpack and followed him. The row home was a nightmare. The front door was reinforced with a heavy wooden plank, and the windows were completely blacked out with thick trash bags. Inside, the air was stale and smelled like mold, sweat, and cheap chemical vanilla air freshener. He led me to a small room on the 2nd floor. There was a dirty mattress on the floor, a space heater, and nothing else. He told me to get myself right and lock the door behind him. For the first day, it felt like a twisted kind of salvation. I used the bags he gave me. The sickness faded. The warmth of the heater lulled me to sleep. And for a few hours, the nightmare of the avenue disappeared. But when I woke up, the sickness was creeping back in. The bone-deep ache was starting to return. The door unlocked, and Marcus walked in. He didn't look polite anymore. His demeanor had shifted into something cold and terrifyingly businesslike. He sat a small plastic bag on the floor, far out of my reach. "You feeling better?" he asked. I nodded, staring at the bag. "Yeah, I should probably get going." Marcus laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Go where? Back to the cardboard box? It's freezing out there, and you're going to be sick again in an hour." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Here's how this works from now on. I provide the medicine. I keep you from getting sick. I keep you warm. But rent isn't free. I have friends coming over later. You're going to be nice to them. You're going to do whatever they ask. If you do, You get the bag. If you don't..." He picked up the bag and slipped it back into his pocket. I unlock the front door, and you walk out, free to go. The psychological horror of that moment is something I still discuss in therapy every single week. He wasn't tying me to a radiator. He wasn't putting a gun to my head. He didn't have to. He understood the weaponization of my own biology. He knew that the threat of throwing me back out into the freezing cold to endure the agonizing torture of withdrawal was infinitely more powerful than any physical chain he could buy at a hardware store. He had engineered a perfect, invisible cage. The lock on the door wasn't keeping me in. My own terror was. I stayed in that room for 3 weeks. I won't detail what happened when his friends came over. It's a dark, suppressed corner of my mind that I refuse to visit if I don't have to. I was effectively a slave, held hostage by my own bloodstream in an abandoned building literally steps away from thousands of people walking to work, catching trains, and living normal lives. That is the true terror of Kensington. It is a war zone hidden in plain sight, where predators operate with absolute impunity because the state has deemed the victims too broken to protect. I eventually escaped. One night, a rival dealer threw a brick through the downstairs window, causing a chaotic turf dispute on the front porch. Marcus ran downstairs with a bat, leaving my door unlocked. I didn't grab my backpack. I didn't grab my coat. I just ran. I ran until my feet bled straight into the emergency room of a hospital miles away from the avenue. I've been clean for 2 years now. I have a job, an apartment, and I moved halfway across the country. But whenever I get a normal stomach bug or the flu and my body starts to ache, panic sets in. The ghost of that room comes back. I survived. But I know for a fact that the mattress in that room didn't stay empty for long. On Kensington Avenue, there is always another girl freezing under a bridge, waiting for a polite man to offer her a warm place to stay. The idea of being held hostage not by chains, but by your own biology, is a level of psychological horror that movies simply cannot replicate. I want to know what you guys think. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the safe option turned out to be a trap? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If these true urban survival stories are giving you chills, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepy Digest. It pushes these stories out to more people. Now, let's get into our final story and find out what happens when the city itself becomes the monster. Story 3, the 45-minute death sentence. When the situation in your city gets bad enough, you realize that the government isn't coming to save anyone. If anything is going to get done, it has to be done by regular people. For a few years, I drove a mobile outreach van for a small, independent mutual aid group. Our mission was incredibly simple. We didn't have millions in funding, and we weren't solving the opioid epidemic. We were just trying to keep people alive for one more day. We would pack a beat-up Ford Transit van with hundreds of bottles of water, clean syringes to prevent HIV outbreaks, sterile bandages for the horrific xylazine flesh wounds, and heavy blankets for the winter. We would park on the side streets off Kensington Avenue, open the back doors, and do what we could. Building trust with the unhoused population there takes time. These are people who have been abused, arrested, and exploited their entire lives. They avoid uniforms, they avoid clipboards. But over time, because we showed up at the same spot, at the same time, every single week, they began to trust us. They would come to us for clean socks, and eventually, some of them would ask us for help getting into a rehab facility. It was grueling, heartbreaking work, but it felt like we were actually making a microscopic dent in the misery. Then, the bureaucracy got involved. In 2025, the Philadelphia City Council, heavily backed by the mayor, passed a piece of legislation known as Bill number 240665-AA. To the local news stations and the affluent residents living in the newly gentrified districts nearby, the bill was sold as a neighborhood cleanup initiative. They called it nuisance abatement. The politicians stood in front of cameras, surrounded by school children, claiming they were giving the community back to the taxpayers. But when we actually read the text of the law, a profound, sickening dread washed over our entire organization. The city didn't ban us outright. That would look too cruel on paper. Instead, they weaponized the mundane mechanics of zoning laws to make it legally impossible for us to save lives. The new law mandated that any mobile aid van distributing food, water, or supplies could not remain in any single location within the district for more than 45 consecutive minutes. Once that 45-minute timer expired, we were legally required to pack up our entire operation, start the engine, and physically drive at least 1,000 feet away to a new location. If a police officer caught us parked for 46 minutes, we would be hit with a massive $1,000 fine. 3 strikes, and our operational permit was permanently revoked. Furthermore, mobile medical vans, the ones actually treating the horrific rotting flesh wounds, were banned from operating during the day entirely. They were legally restricted to operating only between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty. They weren't fighting the disease. They were just criminalizing the people trying to bandage the symptoms. The true horror of this legislation didn't hit me until a freezing night in early December, just days after the city started strictly enforcing the new rules. The temperature was hovering around 25 degrees. We pulled the transit van onto a dark side street near Kensington Avenue. We had a massive load of thermal blankets and hot soup. The moment we parked, a crowd began to emerge from the shadows of the abandoned factories. These people were in terrible shape. Some were limping on heavily bandaged, infected legs. Some were shivering so violently they could barely stand. I threw the van in park, jumped out, and started a stopwatch on my phone. 45 minutes. It takes at least 10 minutes just to safely unload the heavy bins, set up the folding tables, and organize the chaotic, desperate crowd into some semblance of a line. 35 minutes. We started handing out the hot soup and the blankets. The desperation was palpable. People were crying, thanking us, wrapping the heavy thermal foil around their freezing shoulders. I was moving as fast as humanly possible, tossing socks, pouring soup, trying to manage the crush of bodies. 2000. I noticed a Philadelphia police cruiser slowly roll onto the end of the block. It didn't turn its sirens on. It just parked at the intersection, idling in the dark. The officers inside were watching us. They were watching the clock. 10 o'clock. The line was still 20 people deep. More people were shuffling down the block, drawn by the smell of the food. "We have to pack it up," my team leader yelled, looking at the police cruiser. 10 minutes, start loading the bins." "We have half a line left," I yelled back, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "There's a guy back there with no shoes. If we get a $1,000 fine, we can't buy supplies for the rest of the month," she snapped, her voice breaking. "Pack the van, now." The psychological agony of that moment is hard to articulate. We were forced to start ripping down the folding tables while starving, freezing people were literally reaching out their hands toward us. "Please, man, just one blanket," a skeletal guy with severe sores on his face begged, grabbing my jacket sleeve as I hoisted a bin into the back of the van. "It's so cold." I had a blanket sitting right next to my foot. It would take me 2 seconds to hand it to him. But the police cruiser at the end of the block flashed its headlights. A silent, terrifying warning. I looked at the guy's desperate eyes. Then I looked at the cops. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with shame. "We have to move. We'll be a few blocks down." I slammed the heavy metal doors of the van shut, locked them, and climbed into the driver's seat. I turned the key in the ignition. As I put the van in drive and slowly pulled away from the curb, I looked in the side mirror. I watched a crowd of 20 freezing, desperate human beings standing in the exhaust fumes of our van, watching their only source of warmth drive away into the night. We hadn't run out of supplies. We hadn't run out of money. We were legally mandated by the city to abandon them. The city council called it giving the community back to the residents. They called it nuisance abatement. But as I drove that mandatory 1,000 feet, gripping the steering wheel until my hands went numb, I realized the absolute, terrifying truth about modern municipal policy. The state doesn't care if you die. In fact, if you are poor enough and sick enough, and your existence drives down the property value of the trendy new condos they are building, they prefer it. They just don't want you to die where the taxpayers have to look at you. They want you to die quietly, in the dark, 1,000 feet away. I quit the outreach group a week later. I couldn't handle the stopwatch anymore. I couldn't handle the feeling of turning my back on a dying person just to satisfy a zoning law. By the spring of 2026, the streets of Kensington looked drastically different. The massive crowds around the aid vans were gone because most of the aid groups had been fined out of existence. The business corridors looked cleaner. The politicians patted themselves on the back on the local news. But if you walk down those dark, lightless side streets under the L train, the bodies are still there. They are just colder, sicker, and entirely alone. Because the scariest thing about a bureaucracy isn't that it's inefficient. It's that when it finally decides to erase you, it does it entirely legally. If you take anything away from these stories, let it be this. The monsters on our streets aren't hiding in the shadows. They are operating in broad daylight, sometimes with a permit. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think cities are intentionally trying to hide their crises? Or is this just a broken system collapsing? Sound off in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going.